The sons of Shem were Elam and Asher and Arpachshad and Lud, and this is going to be a long year. Okay, don't worry. There's only 3 genealogies in this first week. We're kicking off a year through the Bible, and if you're doing the Old Testament along with the New Testament, then follow along on this playlist. We're following the 5-day Bible reading program, which is linked in the description below. And it makes sense that we would start, of course, with the first book of the Bible. Well, Genesis is the first of what we call the 5 books of Moses. He would have been writing this while they were wandering, while the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. You think about the Israelites coming out of Egypt. They were enslaved for 400 years. The only knowledge they would have had of God, as far as we know, would have been the stories that would have been passed down to them orally. But in a very real sense, they didn't know God. They had not been introduced to the God of heaven. So you can think about the book of Genesis as God introducing himself to his people. But I think that the book of Genesis holds the same purpose for us. The book of Genesis teaches us about who God is, who we are as humans, and what that relationship is like. Genesis 1 to 11 are disproportionately important, I think. This is where we came from, how things began, what went wrong, what the solution is, all of that packed into the first 11 chapters of the Bible. Genesis 1 to 11 works in kind of 2 sections that parallel each other. Chapters 1 and 2, God makes everything and he makes it the way it is supposed to be. This is the ideal. Not only the earth, the creation, nature itself, God says it's good, it's good, it's good. But we see that man is created in God's image, set up on the earth to be a ruler over the earth on God's behalf, having dominion over the earth with the authority that God has given him as his image bearer. And even the relationship between humans, we see at the end of chapter 2, relationship between humans is as God intended it to be. But the ideal doesn't last long. And in chapter 3, we see humans rebelling against God. Not only are Adam and Eve reaching out to take that fruit which God had forbidden, but they are reaching out to take control of life for themselves, to define reality for themselves and say, God, I know what you said about what is good, but this looks good to me. Seduced by the serpent, they rebel against God. And of course, there are tremendous eternal consequences for that, which are spelled out. But there's going to be a separation now. And now the earth is cursed. Creation is broken. And people are separated from God, and they are separated from each other. They begin to blame one another, distrust one another. And I think for that reason, we should think of chapter 4 as a continuation of chapter 3, because it shows us where this goes. That the rebellion of man against God ends up with man turning against his fellow human, his brother. We learn about the line of Cain, and then chapter 5 is about how the consequence of this is just one after another. Generations come, generations go, and everybody dies. Death being the result of sin. And so in chapter 6, God has finally had enough. This is God undoing what he has done. In fact, you can see with the flood a reversal of Genesis chapter 1. But then the second story begins after the flood, when there's essentially a recreation. But like in chapters 1 through 3, this new creation doesn't take very long to become corrupted. In fact, Noah will sin with fruit, and from there things will just go farther downhill, culminating in chapter 11, the story of the Tower of Babel. And so if you're following along, you think, okay, there was a creation, and then there was a fall, and then God wiped everything out with the flood, and then we started over. There was a recreation, there's another fall, and so now God's going to, start over again? And that brings us to chapter 12, which we see that God is not going to wipe everything out again and start over. Instead, he is putting into action a solution to bring back this blessing that he originally gave to humanity, a blessing that will be for the whole world, and that blessing will come about through one man and his family, and that is Abraham. And so notice that promised blessing to Abraham in chapter 12, and how that is the answer to the problem of sin that was introduced in chapters 1 to 11. But also notice in chapters 12 through 15 how this from the beginning is a difficult thing for Abraham. He's an older man, him and his wife unable to have children. He's been given this amazing blessing of a nation that will come from him, a land that will belong to him. But yet he travels around from place to place. He builds tents to live in himself. And then in chapter 15, he's struggling with all this. He says, God, you've given me this promise, but I don't even have a son. And so what, my servant is going to be my heir? This is a difficult thing for Abraham. And of course, it takes a lot of faith. And as this week's reading closes, we see God doubling down on that promise, making a covenant with Abraham and saying, no, you will have a son, and I will bring about this promised blessing through your son and through your family, so that you will bring a blessing to the entire world. And that is the amazing thing in reading the book of Genesis, to see God's faithfulness from the very beginning, what he planned for humanity, how humanity ruined that, and how God has been working ever since in his faithful patience and his wisdom to bring about the restoration of this blessing for his people. And he is faithful and has been faithful to that and will be faithful to that promise until the end. So that's Genesis 1 to 15. Do your best with the names and the genealogies. Don't let it bog you down. There's more to come. I hate to tell you, this is just the beginning. There's always going to be difficult sections of these readings, but keep the larger story in mind and see the amazing way this story is told to us, and just say those names like you mean it, and no one will know the difference.